they're preparing their own public and they're preparing the international community for the inevitable satellite images that we're going to see of large numbers of North Korean troops being killed and buried, and also opening the door to this tranche not being the only tranche of North Korean troops that come in. More North Koreans could follow. When the first reports of between 1,500 to 3,000 troops inside Russia were announced 2 weeks ago, BBC correspondents in Vladivostok and other parts of the Russian Far East were suggesting that the number may have been quite less. But now it looks as if much more than that number have arrived. We're looking at a minimum of 8,000 and probably a contingent of 10 to 12,000 if we look at the combined reports of the US, South Korea, and Ukrainian intelligence. So this is quite a sizable deployment. And the vast majority of this deployment is likely to be confined to the area of Kursk, where the Ukrainians hold territory and the Russians are trying to get it back. They've already taken back between one quarter and one half of the occupied territory that the Ukrainians held before this. So this is another push. And there are reports today that the first combat operations between these North Korean forces and Ukrainian regulars are currently underway.
So there has been clashes as such between North Korean troops and Ukrainian troops. That's now confirmed, or we're getting reports of that now.
Well, we're getting reports that the North Koreans and Ukrainians are currently in the line of fire in Kursk. Whether those have led to clashes that have resulted in the loss of lives on either side or significant exchanges of weaponry, that hasn't been reported yet. But it does appear as if the announcement a few days ago that they were coming within days to start an open combat appears to have come to fruition.
And there are also some reports of kind of some of the commanders who have been sent over by the North Koreans to oversee the troops there. Do we know much about who's been sent from North Korea to lead these troops?
Yeah, well, we know a little bit, at least from the Ukrainian side, that there were three generals that were named. There was Colonel General Kim Young Bok and Colonel General Ri Chang Ho. Both of these were connected to the North Korean General Staff. I think that Kim Young Bok is quite interesting because he oversees the North Korean Special Forces, and Special Forces would be very potentially effective in providing the Russians with training and engineering support, as well as just simply military advice. And when the Russians are using one half of their shells coming from North Korean origin, when the Russians are using Hwasong 11 missiles on Ukrainian targets, this provides them with the know how they need to make more effective use of these North Korean weapons. Moreover, because a figure like Kim Yong Bak and the North Korean Special Forces would probably have exposure to the technologies of Iran, that could also help them make the Iranian ballistic missiles and Iranian drones interoperable with North Korean ones on a common front line. So that would be something that'd be quite useful. Also, we've seen a history of special forces being used quite effectively in various conflict theaters around the world, particularly during the Cold War when they were deployed to Angola, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. They helped Robert Mugabe consolidate power, for instance. And they also were most recently allegedly used in Syria, where they helped Assad recapture Aleppo. So I would be most concerned, I think, of the those first two that I mentioned with the general staff about Kim Yong Bak. The third one that's interesting is Sin Kim Cho. He's coming from the main operational directorate, and that probably suggests that there is a mixture of an overseer from an administrative side, a special forces commander, and Ri Chang Ho, who's in intelligence. So each of these represent different branches of the North Korean military.
And so these special forces will really be a concern for the Ukrainians on the ground as well, won't they?
Yeah, because this pushes back against the narrative that everybody that the North Koreans have brought in are cannon fodder. They, particularly because the Ukrainians have not just pointed to these three generals, but they've also pointed to the existence of about 500 officers also being deployed. So this suggests that there is a North Korean command structure operating inside the military theater. So there's going to be North Korean troops responding to North Korean commanders and North Korean senior command also. So and that will ensure that their adaptation to the new environment will be a lot more smooth and credible than what we often see when foreign fighters come in. Like, for example, when the Wagner Group tried to bring in Syrian foreign fighters into the Libyan conflict to fight to counterweight those of the Syrian mercenaries that were fighting for Turkey, they didn't have that kind of local command structure that's there. But now they do, right? So that's why I don't think we should be reading too much into the initial teething troubles that we were hearing about and the reports of racism being leveled at North Korean forces. it's pretty clear that the North Koreans have their own sub-command structure. That's really pulling the strings, and that is to be expected because number one, amongst these officers are also possibly embassy staff who can help them with basics of the Russian language and help them with some of the other non-military aspects. And also, this ensures that the remittances and the funding that goes to these North Korean troops, which is to the tune of $2,000 a month, most of that funding ends up going back to the North Korean state, just like the way the North Koreans would use overseers to extract whatever the guest workers in different parts of the world would earn.
So the North Korean state is really making, to use a phrase, a pretty penny on this.
Yes, exactly. I mean, like, it may not seem like very much for a typical state, but this is a large amount of hard currency for North Korea, which is probably amongst the most isolated countries in the world. And if you add to the fact that the Simpson Center estimated that during the first year of North Korea's supply of arms to Russia, they were making $1 billion off of those arms sales. And those are probably based on baselines of shell deployments in the 3 to 5 million range, not the 8 million range that we're thinking now. They're making quite a lot of money off of both weapons and troops, and that's enough money to keep the Chinese a bit concerned because now the North Koreans have another patron who they can clearly respond to. And if the Russians want the North Koreans to do something that Beijing doesn't want, then they have less leverage than they used to in the past.
So, Russia have been to an extent trying to play this down. Oh, we're bringing in an ally to help defend Russian territory, but especially given the amount of troops and infrastructure and personnel that are coming with this detachment, this really is quite an escalation.
Yes, definitely, it's quite an escalation. It's also curious that the North Koreans and the Russians are not actually downplaying it as much as one might think. Keep in mind, this is a Russian government that refuses 2.5 years into a war to even often use the word war. They still use special military operation for it. They denied the presence of little green men in Crimea that took over the peninsula. They denied their military intervention in Syria had real boots on the ground. So for them to even say that they're bringing in North Korea as an ally, that this North Korean deployment is legal, and for the North Koreans to also be open about making a similar kind of defense is something quite significant. Because I think the Russians realize that they're wanting to, number one, send a message towards the West. They want to show that they're doing this in retaliation for the Kursk offensive, and also for Ukraine using NATO class weaponry against Russian targets and try to deter the Ukrainians from getting broader permissions for that. And secondly, they're preparing their own public and they're preparing the international community for the inevitable satellite images that we're going to see of large numbers of North Korean troops being killed and buried, and also opening the door to this tranche not being the only tranche of North Korean troops that come in. More North Koreans could follow. If you're looking at what the North Korean foreign minister was saying just a few days ago, we're in this to the end to help Russia beat Ukraine. So even though Russia has had a long history of using smoke and mirrors and denying seemingly obvious facts, and North Korea also is very secretive about how it operates. The fact that they're not really denying their support is interesting. Even though they might use some camouflage and deflection tactics, like labeling North Koreans as Buryads or giving them fake Russian passports, that's more aimed at misleading the enemy than misleading the international community.
And you mentioned before China will have concerns about this. Have we heard anything more from China, or do we know more about how they're feeling about one of their neighbors now being deployed in this hot war?
Well, China has been quite cautious, obviously, in terms of making statements. There was one press conference with the Chinese Foreign Ministry on the 1st of November. It was quite interesting. He was asked about it actually in one of those, pretty censored environments. And he was basically saying that Russia and North Korea are sovereign countries. They have the right to do what is acting in their own interests. But we want peace in Ukraine. We're supporting a peace plan. I want everybody to stop adding fuel to the fire and get to the bargaining table. That was basically what the predictable Chinese position would be. Behind that, there's certainly concern, obviously, if the North Koreans are going to be able to play the Chinese and Russians off each other, because North Korea under Kim Il sung did that throughout the Cold War, playing the Soviets and the Chinese off each other, sometimes to the detriment of either Moscow or Beijing. Uh, and also, there is the concern about what exactly the Russians will give the North Koreans in return. China does not want the North Korean state to implode, but neither does it want it to have even more upgrades to its nuclear arsenal. So it starts the war, or it finds itself in a situation where war is thrust upon it by the Americans or by another party, and the Chinese have to go and rush to their defense. So they are really trying to limit obviously the supply of nuclear material, or ICBM adjustments, because North Korea is just testing ICBMs, or a drastic improvement in the weaponization of space. Because in any of those areas, North Korea could become a wild card that's unpredictable and accountable to neither Moscow nor Beijing if it gets that technology. So that's something that I think that the Chinese are a little bit concerned about. But also, there's opportunities for China also, and China is going to be able to leverage any acquiescence to this or any refusal to act on American pressure to get concessions out of North Korea and other spheres. Like they want access to the Tumen River so they can get their vessels going right through the North Korean territory into the Sea of Japan. And then from the Sea of Japan up to the Arctic via the Polar Silk Road. They don't want to have to go around and circumnavigate the South Korean coast. And North Korea always used to be against that. But after North Korea started arming Russia, and Xi Jinping raised it publicly with Putin in last May, already the North Koreans are making concessions there. So the Chinese might be able to be quite pragmatic and leverage the situation for their own geostrategic interests in Northeast Asia and the Arctic, but they also are not going to be a bit concerned about what exactly the Russians have promised the North Koreans, because it's really unclear, I think, to almost anybody what exactly transpired in that those conversations between Putin and Kim and the numerous lower level meetings that have occurred over the past year.
And Beijing, of course, aren't the only ones who are concerned. South Korea as well are voicing concerns about this. There's now reports they might be willing to send either more support or maybe even observers of some kind to see what exactly North Korea will be doing in Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, South Korea is very, very concerned about the current situation because it's the first time that in this conflict of this scale, we've seen this number of North Korean forces coming in. Even in the other conflicts that I mentioned earlier, like Angola and Mozambique, we're talking a maximum of 3,000 forces, most of them not in an attritional combat theater. This is something very new for the South Koreans to see, and they clearly want to get a grip of what's happening. But the big question is, what will the South Koreans be able to give beyond tactical support, engineering support, and advice? Will they actually lift the residual restrictions that they have on arming an active conflict party? And it appears as if the South Koreans will have to give those arms directly to Ukraine because Poland is dragging its feet on transferring arms already promised to from South Korea to them to the Ukrainians indirectly. So that's something that they have to change. And if they do change that, we should watch out for artillery shells of various kinds landing. They have an estimated 3.4 million 105 milliliter artillery shells. That could be helpful in counteracting North Korean ones. They have much fewer, but they still have a potent capacity to produce 155 millimeter ones. So that's something to watch. And finally, it's not. It's been denied by the South Koreans right now, but that doesn't mean the Ukrainians are going to stop pushing. The Ukrainians really want Tomahawk style cruise missiles or long range missiles of that type, and the South Koreans have Tomahawk style missiles in their arsenal. And if the situation gets really bad, and maybe if there's another tranche of North Korean troops that arrive, or there's proof that Russia has been aiding North Korea in the space or nuclear spheres or something like this, then I think the Ukrainians will be hopeful or at least see an avenue to maybe get some of those missiles into their hands and out of South Korea's hands too. So there's a lot that South Korea can do for Ukraine. South Korea is certainly much more open than at any time during the war to go beyond sanctions and solidarity and actually start helping them. And I think it's something that could be something to watch in the weeks and months ahead.
Of course, here in Europe and obviously in the US, everyone is really quite caught up now with the US election ahead of most other news stories. But have we seen any real reaction from the West yet, or any promise of a response?
Well, I think that the Western responses in general have been a little bit too slow towards this, and that's been something that I've had a bit of concern about. I think that the narrative that's coming through from the British ambassador to the United Nations and from Secretary General Mark Rutte and even from the State Department that this is some kind of a desperation measure from Vladimir Putin kind of oversimplifies the situation and overlooks and undermines just how dangerous this is. The North Koreans are sending special forces that have experience in training. It's not just a bunch of cannon fodder. And also, North Korea is plugging gaps in the front lines. In Kursk, they're absorbing Ukrainian offensives so the Russians can focus their offensive momentum in Donetsk where they have the advantage, and the Russians don't have to get distracted by splitting their forces anymore as much. So it's pretty clear that there's a strategic benefit to Russia recruiting these North Korean troops, and the Western response is overly complacent. It's certainly out of step with what people in both Seoul and Tokyo are feeling, based on what I've been learning from my sources in South Korea and Japan. So, yeah, I am a bit frustrated with the Western response just because it just seems a little too passive. But I think that there's still going to be an avenue, especially once the election's over with, to start doing something more concrete. And I think that if it becomes clear that this is a retaliation for the West greenlighting the Ukrainian strikes on NATO targets, then I think that it could be beneficial for the Ukrainians to get a broader remit to do that and to maybe strike some of these training centers where the North Koreans are working on before they come to the front lines and things like this, right? So there'll be a lot of clamoring from Ukraine for those permissions. I think that the more that this is seen as a deliberate provocation by Russia, and the more that this is actually seen as something dangerous and not just a desperation measure, the more likely it is the West will agree with what Kiev wants.
Dr. Samuel Ramani, thank you very much for speaking to us today.
Thank you very much.